Um,
Mhm, mhm.
and we can look later on to see whether or not it's appropriate to whether we need to edit anything out of the discussion. So if that's okay with everybody, we're going ahead and recording right now, and I have to push OK here. Of course, in the meantime, Venezuela has suffered a terrible tragedy. And I haven't heard the latest, but I heard the potential for maybe even thousands killed. I think it would be good to have a short update on that, maybe even before Steve starts, and then we could include that in our discussion later on. What are the implications for solidarity at this time as a result of this great tragedy? Is this going to be an opportunity for disaster capitalism or disaster imperialism? Or could it also be an opportunity for the solidarity movement in terms of how we respond? So I think that's an important discussion that we can begin to have. I know some people are already having that discussion, um, and we might want to hear from several people here what they're thinking about that. Um, does anybody want to share a little bit of information now about what's happened with the earthquakes, or shall we wait till later? If nobody's jumping out there, then I'll just ask Steve to go ahead and begin. Thank you so much, Steve, for being
Sure,
here.
sure. I think that the issue of the earthquakes, there were two major ones uh, in rapid succession. And I think that issue is important to take advantage of the current situation because, Marco Rubio and Trump are all talking a solidarity type, line with regard to their friends in the Venezuelan government, specifically Delcy Rodriguez. But the fact of the matter is that in spite of all the hype about Venezuela, accepting close, friendly relations with the United States, um, Washington hasn't budged an inch with regard to the sanctions. There's all this talk about sanction relief and the term sanction waivers, which is really a euphemism, because the fact of the matter is that the sanctions have not been lifted at all. What Washington has done has been to authorize licenses, but those licenses are very restrictive, so that all the sanctions are still in place. None of the sanctions have been, abrogated. And the licenses, really dictate the kinds of commercial relations in terms of, what countries can enter into commercial relations with Venezuela. Of course, Cuba, Iran, Russia, China, they're all excluded in some cases. The Venezuelan revenue from investments are deposited abroad, first in Qatar and now more recently in the United States. Their accounts, which are not being audited, nobody really knows the details of what's happening to that money. And the fact of the matter is that the United States has the final say as to how this money is being allocated. As a matter of fact, specifically, the Department of the Secretary of State is the one who decides. All the decisions with regard to those allocations passes through the hands of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Um, the second point that I think has major implications is with regard to the issue of the accusations against Maduro and Celia Flores. We all know that the accusation that Maduro was involved in this cartel de los soles. I mean, there's so much evidence that this was just a bogus excuse for kidnapping Maduro and Flores. So I'm certainly not going to go into any detail, but I will mention that Terry Manson, uh, who was with me when I spoke um, back in 2018, interviewed Fulton Armstrong was a professor at Washington, American University in Washington, and spent his whole adult life working with U.S. intelligence and specifically the CIA. And Fulton has, stated in this interview that he doesn't know any member of the intelligence community, and he knows them all. He doesn't know any member of the community other than people who currently work for the government who believe that the Cartel de los Soles exists. So, I mean, the issue of Maduro being involved in drug trafficking is completely without any foundation at all. But I think that the issue that has to be dealt with is that the association or the connection between drug trafficking and terrorism has to be questioned. And it's a sticky issue because a lot of people will say, this is terrorism. Look what, drugs are doing to the community in the United States, so many young people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is that drug traffickers and even the kingpins of the cartels in Mexico, they're bad people and they should be locked up, but they're not terrorists. And if you accept that, if you accept the narrative of the Trump administration that this is terrorism and therefore the United States has the right to do everything under the sun, the bombing of the boats in the Caribbean. I mean, if you accept that logic, then you might accept, or you'd have a hard time arguing with people about all the atrocities that the Trump administration is committing. So that relationship between drug trafficking and terrorism has to be questioned and refuted. The other thing is that the right-wing resurgence over the recent past with the election of De La Espriella in Colombia, Cast in Chile, the narrative of these right-wingers is precisely that drug trafficking and terrorism are one of the same. And they're all vulnerable. Most of them are vulnerable. I mean, De La Espriella is a lawyer who defended paramilitary figures and drug traffickers. And in the case of Colombia, it's hard to separate the two, as we know in the case of Uribe and his father, that the paramilitary people were drug traffickers. And these are the people that De La Espriella defended. In the case of Noboa, also in the case of Honduras with Juan Orlando Hernandez, who Trump pardoned. So that there is a lot of issues that can be raised and a lot of arguments that can be raised against this association between terrorism and drug trafficking and the narrative that the binary narrative that the right wing is combating terrorism and drug trafficking and the left wing is supporting it, or at least turning a blind eye to drug trafficking. The discussion of what is happening in Venezuela is of paramount importance. As Gerry pointed out, it's polarizing the left to a certain extent. Even the Solidarity movement is being polarized to a certain extent over the issue. So the issue has to be dealt with, and it's confusing. But one of the things that I think has to be pointed out is that people shouldn't, and there's a certain naivete here, that people are taking at face value the narrative of President Trump. I mean, he talks about how closely he's working with the Venezuelan government, how the Venezuelan government is cooperating. And so people conclude that Delcy Rodriguez and the people who surround her have capitulated and are collaborating. They're collaborators with Washington without questioning whether this narrative of Trump is just another example of hype in which he's really overstating the case with regard to the relations between Caracas and Washington. I think Roger mentioned to me a while back that people have told him, people high up in the Venezuelan government, told him, I believe it was Roger who said this to me, that every concession that Delcy Rodriguez makes, every decision that's made with regard to relations with the United States and U.S. capital is fought out. So that it's not as if Washington is imposing on Venezuela everything that Delcy says and does. There's a give and take process. And of course, Washington has the upper hand. There's no question about it. But the fact of the matter is that there's resistance also. And the other point that I think has to be made is it has to be emphasized how different Venezuela is, along with Cuba, from the other pink-tide progressive governments in Latin America. I mean, certainly all the governments are in the, are being targeted by the United States. Look at the case of Brazil with Lula. But Venezuela and Cuba are in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism. And I think that that issue also has to be emphasized because, there's nothing comparable in terms of the regime change efforts by the United States, beginning practically at the outset of Hugo Chavez's government, or shortly after he was elected in 1998, at least by late 2001, and with the attempted coup in 2002. I mean, just one regime change attempt after another. And this accelerated under Maduro. And probably people are familiar with some of these details, but it really has to be emphasized. The Guarimba, which was initiated by Leopoldo Lopez and Maria Corina Machado in 2014. And this is another point that has to be emphasized, is that our people in Caracas, beginning with Leopoldo Lopez and then Juan Guaido and now Maria Corina Machado, those people aren't just opposition people. They represent the extreme right because the opposition has always been somewhat divided, just like, that shouldn't be surprising, just like any political movement, you're going to have different tendencies. But the tendency of the opposition or the factionalism in the opposition that goes, back to the beginning of the Maduro government, beginning of the Chavez government, Leopoldo Lopez represented the extreme right. And these are the people that the United States has been supporting after the Guarimba, the Operation Gideon, with the paramilitary coming down from Colombia, supported economically by Guaido and orchestrated from Miami, and involving 2 Green Berets who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. The 2 drone attacks that attempted to assassinate Maduro and the First Lady. Maduro was speaking publicly, and 2 drones fortunately exploded away from him. But the attempt obviously was to assassinate him. The crippling sanctions, the recognition of the shadow government of Juan Guaido, and the list goes on and on. So that the differentiation between the Venezuelan case and the other pink-tide governments and the similarity between the Venezuelan case and Cuba has to be emphasized. And why is it? Why is it that Venezuela has been in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism? And it has, a lot to do with the oil, and that's always mentioned as a major factor. But I think one thing that has to be brought out in that regard is we have to differentiate between, is it about just the fact that the United States wants to get its hands on the oil, that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and is it just about that the United States needs that oil? Because if that's the explanation, well, Maduro indicated that he was willing to make concessions in terms of investment and in terms of commercial relations with the United States, etc. So that obviously doesn't explain the war on Venezuela, is a term that I think should be used. The war on Venezuela, the bombing in the Caribbean, the accusations against Maduro with regard to the Cartel de los Soles, and culminating with the kidnapping of Maduro and the First Lady. There is a second part of that discussion, which I think should be analyzed, and that is that it's not just about getting a hold of the oil, it's about super profits. And it has to do with the crisis of US capitalism, and that in a situation of crisis, as a result of overaccumulation, the tendency of profits to decline, that super profits injects adrenaline into the system. And the problem with the decline of overaccumulation and the declining rate of profit is that the capitalists don't reinvest. And there's not a reproduction of capital, which is essential for the survival of the capitalist system. Super profits means investments, overinvestments, but that gets the economy back on track. So that is one explanation. But I think that the other point that has to be raised with regard to why Venezuela and Cuba have been targeted by US imperialism is that the longevity and differentiating the Venezuelan case with the rest of the pink tide. I mean, the Chavista government has been in power for over a quarter of a century, uninterrupted. And that has no comparison with the other pink tide governments, which have come and gone and then returned. In the case of Brazil, Lula, Rousseff, and then the parliamentary coup against her. And then Lula came back after Bolsonaro. Or in the case of Bolivia with Evo Morales and then Arce after the coup that overthrew Morales. Or in the case of Argentina, the Peronistas, the Kirchners, and then Fernandez, and then between the two, Macri. So that has been interrupted rule. In the case of Venezuela, there's a longevity there. And I think that is something that the United States has its eyes on because, the narrative of those who defend capitalism is that socialism doesn't work. Any demonstration of a government that's committed to socialism, that has socialism as a goal, that survives in spite of all the destabilization attempts, in the case of Venezuela, in the case of Cuba, in the case of the Soviet Union, in the case of each one of the countries that have been committed to socialism, that the fact that a government survives these regime change attempts over such an extended period of time makes them particularly vulnerable to destabilization and regime change attempts on the part of Washington. And this is exactly what happened in the case of Venezuela, that the economic destabilization that took place during the first Trump administration, and a point that I'm not going to get into because I'd have to go into detail, but I think it's extremely important. And that is that the downspin of the Venezuelan economy did not occur prior to the sanctions against Venezuela. There's a whole discussion in which the opposition and people on the left, the opposition in Venezuela says, no, the economic downturn occurred first and then the sanctions. The people on the left say the two occurred simultaneously, and so the sanctions had a lot to do with it, but corruption and poor government also had a lot to do with it. So it was 50-50. But the fact of the matter is that the sanctions came first. And in order to pinpoint the beginning of those sanctions, it's fallacious to say that they began in 2019, as people in the opposition say, or even 2017, with the first sanctions of the first Trump administration in August of 2017. They began with the executive order of Obama in early 2015, because that's when US companies reduced production in Venezuela and then closed shop and left Venezuela. So I think that point has to be made. But the fact that the Maduro government was able to, the economy was on the path of recovery after the hyperinflation, which reached 130,000% annually. That's hyperinflation. By 2024, the inflation was reduced to between 16 and 48%. I mean, hyperinflation, 16% might seem a lot. By US standards, it certainly is, but not when the inflation previously reached 130,000%. Oil production, which declined to a little over 500,000 barrels a day. By late 2025, Venezuela was producing over 1 million barrels per day of oil. So there was a recovery. On the political front, the opposition was completely put on the defensive. It was fragmented, and it ceased to be a serious challenge to Maduro's hold on power. Firstly, it split in 2020 when a segment of the opposition recognized Maduro's legitimacy and participated in elections. And then, and perhaps even more important than that, as a result of Trump's actions against Venezuela, his demonization of Venezuelan immigration, his bombing of the boats in the Caribbean, his deportation of Venezuelans, the hardcore radical opposition, they're all neoliberals, but there's a extreme, right, which, as I mentioned before, consists of leaders such as Maria Corina Machado, Juan Guaido, and Leopoldo Lopez. Guaido and Lopez belong to the same party, Voluntad Popular, and another segment of the opposition, which is right-wing because it's pro-neoliberal, but people like Enrique Capriles, who was the candidate for the united opposition against Chavez in 2012 and then against Maduro in 2013, and Manuel Rosales, who was the candidate against Chavez in 2006 and then ran for governor of Zulia. He lost the first time and won the second. They broke with Maria Corina Machado, and they have criticized Trump and his policies. So the opposition was very much fragmented. And as a matter of fact, by late 2025, before the kidnapping of Maduro and Celia Flores, they lacked any leadership presence within Venezuela. And then the other factor that explains the recovery, the partial recovery of the Venezuelan economy, was the shadow fleet, which got around the system of sanctions. And Venezuela was able to export oil to China. 80% of the export went to China, but not directly, but through this shadow fleet that went first to different Southeast Asia countries and then was re-exported to China. The Chinese companies, the private Chinese companies, didn't want to suffer. They didn't want to be on the list of secondary sanctions. And so they were very careful. And the shadow fleet consisted of companies that changed their name. They changed the flags on the boats. Sometimes there was a transfer of petroleum from one tanker to another. But that way they got around the sanctions. And the currency that was used was the yuan and Ethereum, the decentralized cryptocurrency. And so there was an important degree of success on the part of the Maduro government. I think that point has to be emphasized, because what happened on January 3rd has to be seen in the context of a defeat for Washington. The fact that the Maduro government was, successful in, bringing about partial recovery and becoming the major political force and consolidating power the way he did. And then the other part of the other part of this explanation for why January 3rd has to be considered a defeat for Washington is that, to everybody's surprise, across the political spectrum, Trump did not impose Maria Corina Machado. And that was, evidence of the resilience of the Chavista movement, that in spite of all the publicity of the corporate media and US politicians and the Nobel Prize, the bogus Peace Commission, that recognized that, viewed Machado as the leader of the opposition with such massive popular support. The fact of the matter is that Trump stated in the press conference on January 3rd, just hours after the kidnapping of Machado in Flores, he said that Maria Corina Machado doesn't have enough backing. Based on a CIA report, Trump stated that Machado doesn't have backing in Venezuela. And a point that hasn't been raised, that I haven't seen the Solidarity Movement raise, is that Trump's statement to the effect that Machado doesn't have substantial support in Venezuela, that should be related to the 2024 presidential elections. And that's a whole other issue that I'm not going to deal with. But the fact of the matter is that she claimed that her candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, received 70% vote on July 28th, 2024. But just, a year and a half went by between then and that press conference on January 3rd, when Trump stated that Machado doesn't have substantial backing in Venezuela. So the fact of the matter is that, the Solidarity Movement has to, focus on the sanctions and what I'm calling, and should be called by everybody, the war on Venezuela. The issue of the sanctions has to be fundamental. And the point has to be raised, firstly, that the sanctions are still in effect, that they haven't been removed at all, that Venezuela is suffering as a result of this system that has been created with the waivers, which consist of licenses in which the United States dictates the terms of those licenses. But in addition to that, the existence of naval fleets, naval forces in the Caribbean, even though not to the extent that they were present in late 2025 and leading up to the kidnapping on January 3rd, 2026, but they're still there. And that is a gross violation of the Declaration of CELAC, the unanimous support for the declaration in January of 2014 that declared Latin America and the Caribbean a zone of peace. But in addition to the issue of the sanctions, in addition to the issue of the U.S. war on Venezuela, it's important for the Solidarity Movement to come to grips with what's being said about Delcy Rodriguez and the whole debate on the left and within the Solidarity Movement, that basically a segment on the left and a segment of the Solidarity Movement that had supported Maduro 100%, but is now saying that Delcy has gone too far, and she should refuse to go along with Washington. That issue has to be faced in all its dimensions. Some people say that Delcy represents what Gramsci called a passive revolution. That is a situation in which a government comes in a revolutionary situation and makes concessions, but succeeds in disarming the revolutionaries on the streets, and eventually undoing all the progressive, all the revolutionary measures. And of course, the comparison is made. The term passive revolution refers, in the case of Gramsci, to the unification of Italy in the mid 19th century and the rise of fascism under Mussolini in a revolutionary situation after World War I with the occupation of factories in northern Italy. So the comparison is made between, fascist Italy and Delcy Rodriguez, as it's made by some on the left with regard to Maduro, that they have really turned their backs on the revolution. And I think that, those people who say that Delcy should say enough is enough, and she should simply, if necessary, just, leave. The hard question has to be asked, what are the options? And people, some people say Delcy herself doesn't have options, and they personalize it in terms of Delcy herself. If Delcy is the president or the interim president of Venezuela, she doesn't have any options. Assuming that she stays in office, what can she do? But I think that we have to go beyond that because the issue shouldn't be personalized. It's not about Delcy Rodriguez. It's about Venezuela. And the point has to be made that if Delcy were to step down, the vacuum would be undoubtedly filled by Maria Corina Machado. And we all know what Machado stands for. So that it's not about the threats, the personal threats against Delcy, which Trump himself made during the press conference on January 3rd, when he said that she would suffer the same fate as Maduro and Flores, or worse, of course, meaning the fate of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, who was assassinated. So sometimes things are framed in those personal terms. But I think we have to go beyond that because it's not just about her, just as it wasn't about Maduro when the Elliot Abrams and other neocons said, Maduro can leave Venezuela. We'll, allow him to take his family with him to wherever he wants. It wasn't about Maduro, and it's not about Delcy Rodriguez either. It's about Venezuela and what would happen if she would have stepped down. We all know what happened on April 11th, 2002, with the coup. It was on the TV screens when the Minister of Interior Relations, Ramon Rodriguez Chacín, and who's not well known now, but he was attacked. And that was given all the publicity in the world in order to send a message to the Chavista rank and file. And the same thing happened to Alex William Saab. So that vacuum that would be created if she stepped down would result in repression Pinochet style. And not only Pinochet style with regard to the repression, but also with regard to an extreme version of neoliberalism. People accusing Rodriguez, just like they accused Maduro, of making concessions to neoliberalism. But in the case of Machado, we're talking about extreme neoliberalism. Machado uses the term popular capitalism, which is the same term that Pinochet used. And Machado talks about the privatization of everything. So that, that would mean, getting rid of PDVSA or converting PDVSA into a rubber stamp type body. And, basically turning over everything to private capital and most of it to foreign capital. And the other aspect that hasn't been raised with regard to what Machado would represent is that Machado and Leopoldo Lopez and Capriles And the opposition to Chavez in general,
Wow.
going back to the beginning of the Chavez government,
Structured currency.
represented something different
I just
from the ruling class. Excuse me? Something different from the ruling class prior to 1998. The ruling class prior to 1998, the political class, tended to be middle class. Because of the corruption, some of those people became upper middle class. But the opposition is strongest in elite universities that were apolitical for the most part previously. And the leaders are not upper middle class. They're among the richest people, or they come from the richest elitist families in Venezuela. And that's the case with Maria Corina Machado. It's the case with Leopoldo Lopez, whose grandfather was an associate and the brother of Eugenio Mendoza, who was the Rockefeller of Venezuela for many decades. And one aspect of that new elite that would be the ruling class if Machado reached power is the racism. And that's an issue that I think should be raised. About a month ago, an opposition entertainment figure by the name of Carlos Baute in Madrid led a rally in favor of Maria Corina Machado, in which and I saw this on the screen, he screamed out, "Fuera la mona," in reference to Delcy Rodriguez. Get out, monkey, referring to Delcy Rodriguez. And that's the kind of language that the opposition used in the first years of the Chavez government until, the NGOs working out of Washington and probably the State Department put the screws on the opposition and said, cool it. But that term monkey was used in reference to Chavez, was used in reference to Aristobal Isturiz, who had been governor of Caracas and then governor of my state where I lived, Anzoátegui, an Afro-Venezuelan. And this term was used all the time back in those days. And here Carlos Baute screamed, "Fuera la mona," but no solamente Baute. The entire public, thousands, perhaps several thousand people, were there, and they were all screaming out in unison, "Fuera la mona." So the next day, Carlos Baute apologized. Maria Corina Machado said she had nothing to do with that. She might have not even been there. But the fact of the matter is that her supporters were there, and they were all shouting, using racist words to refer to Delcy Rodriguez. So let's see. Gerry and Rick asked me to speak for 25, 30 minutes, and I think I've gone over a little bit. But let me just summarize. And that is that a couple of things. One, that what is at stake? The restoration of the old order in the hands of the upper class in Venezuela and everything that upper class represents. And that means, massive privatization, and it means repression against not only the left, but social movements. And we know that is always the case in the Southern Cone countries in the 70s with the military dictatorships that came in during that period. The social movements were targeted. In the case of Chile, the pobladores, the barrios that were most combative, they tended to be the barrios that were that the Communist Party and maybe the left wing of the Socialist Party controlled or were influential. Those were the barrios that were targeted by Pinochet's forces. And so we're not only talking about the Chavista political people, we're talking about the communes and the social movements in general. And the last thing that I wanted to mention was placing this in a larger context in terms of Trump's Shield of the Americas, in which, he has emphasized the rise of these right-wing governments throughout Latin America. I believe that there's no one single explanation. I think each one of these countries has to be analyzed separately in order to understand why this is happening. But for instance, in the case of Argentina, there's no question about it that blackmail has a lot to do with it. When Trump offered $40 billion to Argentina if the right-wing party were to win the congressional elections last year, and indeed they won because that was, what Trump offered the Argentine people. So that, that is one case that has to be analyzed. In the case of Colombia, in the case of Ecuador, each one of these cases is different. But the Shield of the Americas represents a threat to progressives, progressive causes, and progressive movements. And if the right wing were to come to power in Venezuela, well, that would be one more country that joins the ranks of the Shield of the Americas. And one of the things that the Shield of the Americas talks about is, national security, and also in opposition to foreign interference in the continent. That means China stay away from Latin America. That means Russia stay away from Latin America. But especially in the case of China, which is so important economically for Latin America. South America, China is the #1 trading partner with South America. And so that would definitely be affected by the increased influence of the Shield of the Americas in the narrative of the Trump administration in terms of keeping China out of Latin America. So these are the implications of what would happen if Delcy Rodriguez were to just, throw in the towel and say, I don't want to have anything to do with this, and turn things over to Trump, the Trump administration, and eventually Maria Corina Machado and the right wing of Venezuela who would come to power as a result.
Thank you, Steve Ellner, for that excellent grounding and context for us to take up this question. I'm sure that we're going to want to have further discussion and questions regarding, what's the role of the solidarity movement in North America at this point in time? How do we respond to this polarization that exists? And of course, added to that now, how do we respond in the face of this terrible tragedy that just struck Venezuela and the aftermath of it? So I'm going to ask people to either ask questions of Steve or make your own comments. As long as you keep them relatively brief. But before we do that, have that discussion. We don't all know each other here, so we didn't want to take up time with introductions early on. But I think it's important for us to know who's here. And so if you can just very, very briefly, your name and your organization or other quick description, 10 seconds each. I'm Gerry Condon with the Veterans for Peace and the Task Force on the Americas. I'll call on people. Helen, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Helen Jacquard. I'm with Veterans for Peace Task Force on the Americas and the Golden Rule Peace Boat.
Okay, Nan McCurdy.
Yes, I live in Nicaragua. I'm work with Nicanauts of Alliance for Global Justice. I'm part of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and also the Nicaragua webinar series. And it's good to be here with all of you.
Yes, thank you for being here. Angela?
Hi, Angela Marino, and I'm at UC Berkeley, and I there lead a research group called the demuxmedia.org. So I put that in the chat, and I'm with TFA. Thank you.
Thank you. Leonardo?
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you, even though you unmuted. We can't hear you. Well, we'll come back to you. But anyway, Leonardo Flores, Venezuelan American, longtime activist, and currently also working with Code Pink. Um, Ali,
No.
you're muted, Ali.
I'm Ali. I'm working with Fire Design Movement for Social Justice in Canada, in Vancouver right now. And also I'm organizer with Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba.
Okay, thank you for being here. John Perry?
Welcome.
I'm John Perry. I live in Masaya, Nicaragua. I'm with the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and originally from the UK.
Great. Barbara?
Barbara Larkham. I'm with Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and also with Casa Baltimore Limay, a sister city in Nicaragua.
Great, thank you. Rick?
Yeah, Rick Sterling, TFA and other groups, Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center.
Josh?
Yeah, Josh Shirley with Veterans for Peace.
Laura?
Laura Wells with TFA and the Green Party.
Roger?
Good evening. I'm Roger Harris. I'm with the TFA, the Venezuela Solidarity Network.
Thank you, Roger. And Jill?
Jill Clark Golub with the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and Sanctions Kill Americas Without Sanctions in Vermont now and also sometimes in Washington.
All right, Linda?
Hi, I'm Linda Helland. I'm honored to have recently joined the Task Force on the Americas board. I've done a lot of Cuba solidarity work and was briefly part of the Venezuela Embassy Protection Collection in DC. And I think, Steve, I took care of your granddaughter there for a couple days.
Okay.
Justin?
Hi, Fred Mills here, using my son's Zoom. I'm with the Association of Philosophy and Liberation and long time in solidarity with the cause of Latin American sovereignty and integration.
All right, great. Leonardo, do you have one to take another chance to say hello?
Can you hear me now? No?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, there we go.
I didn't do a very good job introducing you, so
Oh,
go
no,
ahead.
you did. It was perfect. Leo also fine. I'm from Venezuela. I'm with the Venezuela Solidarity Network. Nice to see everyone.
Okay, great. Well, let's get going. I guess I'll just start off by
Gerry, Allison.
Yeah.
Did I miss Allison? Allison, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay. No worries. Maybe someone else too. This
Okay,
is Allison Bodine, also here in Vancouver, Canada. I work with Ali in the Fire This Time movement for social justice, and I'm also with the Venezuela Solidarity Network.
Great. Allison, thank you for being here. And thank you all for being here. This is a great collection of wonderful activists to have this important discussion. So I guess I'll just kick it off by asking a question just to deepen the question of what's the appropriate role for the North American Solidarity Movement vis-a-vis Venezuela at this moment. And Steve, you kind of answered that very broadly, but maybe we can have a more specific look at the role of the solidarity movement here.
Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned at the outset was that there is a lot of misconception about what's been happening since January 3rd, because people in the States, generally believe that now, the United States is a friend of Venezuela, and anything that goes wrong in Venezuela is not due to U.S. intervention, that everything to the contrary. And now what happened today with Marco Rubio's statement about helping Venezuela, which I'm not saying is bad news, but I did notice that when he mentioned the support of different countries for Venezuela, he mentioned only right-wing countries. Chile, he mentioned El Salvador, didn't say anything about Brazil, didn't say anything about Mexico, and he didn't say anything about China, of course. So that it seems to me that the point has to be raised and emphasized that the problem is that the events leading up to January 3rd with the war on Venezuela, which explains the economic situation in Venezuela, the economic devastation of the Venezuelan economy, which was due to U.S. sanctions, that nothing has really changed. I mean, the system of sanctions is intact, and that point has to be raised. That the waivers are just that. The sanctions are still in place, and the waivers consist of licenses under terms dictated by the United States, which are not favorable to Venezuela. So, I think that has to be raised. And what I mentioned before also about the U.S. naval presence in the Caribbean, not as forceful as late 2025, but those assets are still there. Threatening Venezuela means that Venezuela, the Venezuelan government, has their arms tied because any decision that goes against Washington's dictates that the United States can threaten Venezuela militarily, and that Trump has made no secret of the fact that there was a second incursion plan following January 3rd, which Trump stated that he decided not to carry out, but that he could carry out at any moment. So I think those issues have to be raised.
And now the U.S. Navy is going to be projecting itself as a part of the rescue efforts. So that's going to be something we need to look at closely. Nan?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said, Steve, on what we need to do. I also agree that educate and focus on ending the war, educate and focus on how detrimental the sanctions are. And also, I think a major campaign to free Maduro and Celia is something that could be very important, not just important, but something that people could grab onto. And then I want to say one more thing. And that is obviously the U.S. no longer cares at all about international law. And because of that, and everything they've done already since January 3rd in Venezuela, I completely believe that the government is held hostage, that the U.S. has made it clear they're going to wage war in one way or another. And, Venezuela is desperate for money to try to improve the situation there. So, they want to be able to sell the oil. So it's complex. It's not black and white. I think we don't know the situation of the government really and what's going on. So I believe we have to support them.
Yeah, Nan, one point I want to make is we don't know the situation, and there are a lot of factors that we don't know about. And we have to recognize that, there are gray areas that, when people call Delcy a sellout or a collaborator, they're talking about issues that we can't refute completely because there are these gray areas. But one thing I want to point out is the importance of emphasizing that the sanctions have caused more damage than most people thought. I mean, I personally, if you had asked me back, when Chavez was president or in the early years of the Maduro government, if you had asked me or if you had told me what was going to happen I would not have thought that the sanctions would have had such a devastating effect economically and as a result politically. So that, issues come up inevitably with regard to, for instance, people will say, well, Delcy Rodriguez was the vice president under a dictatorship. So how good can she be? So that there's certain issues that have to be raised, that have to be dealt with. And we have to be clear that people in Venezuela were devastated. I mean, the situation in Venezuela was unbearable for Venezuelans, still, and they still are, because the situation hasn't improved all that much. And the other issue that should be raised, or the other point that should be raised, is that Venezuela previously, because of the oil, was a privileged third world country compared to all the rest of Latin America. And I can talk about that because I lived in Venezuela for over 40 years. And people's expectations were quite different from the rest of Latin America. So that when the economy went into a tailspin and people started suffering, it was especially difficult psychologically for Venezuelans because they weren't used to that kind of, the middle class was not used to the kind of hardships that they faced as a result. So I think that point has to be raised. And what I said before about the sanctions, that the downturn came after the imposition of sanctions. Of course, the price of oil declined. Venezuela under Maduro from the very outset, Venezuelans were not living as well as they did under Chavez because that had something to do with the price of oil. But in 2015, when Obama issued his executive order and U.S. companies started pulling out of Venezuela, one after another, Kimberly-Clark, Ford, Kellogg's, General Motors. When that happened, the economy started declining in a big way. That began in 2016, 2017. So there are several factors that converged. The price of oil nosedived by the end of 2015. And the sanctions of the Trump administration in August of 2017 kicked in. But the fact of the matter is that prior to that, the situation economically in Venezuela was not bad at all. So that the issue has to be faced. When people say, well, Maduro was a dictator and Delcy was the vice president under Maduro, so how good can she be? But the fact of the matter is that those elections, and we have to respond to the accusation that the elections of 2024 were rigged. And the only real response to that is that those elections could not have been fair and open because the Venezuelan voter had a gun pointed at his or her head. That if Maduro was reelected, the sanctions would continue. And if the opposition candidate won, the sanctions would be lifted. So and you people who are working in the Nicaragua Solidarity Movement, some of you live in Nicaragua, know that full well, because the Nicaraguan people went through the same experience in 1990 with the elections of 1990 and the Civil War, the Contra War, and everything that was happening in Nicaragua. That Nicaraguans also realized that if they reelected Ortega, that the Civil War would continue, and if Chamorro won, the situation would be resolved. So that issue has to be raised and dealt with in order to make clear that the war in Venezuela has had a devastating effect, and although there's corruption like there is every place, including the United States, and policies that were ill-advised. I mean, I have my criticism of some of the policies of the Chavez government as well as Maduro, but much more important than that, and in many cases, as a result of the sanctions and the war in Venezuela, these errors were committed. So the fundamental problem that Venezuela has faced has been the sanctions and the aggression against Venezuela orchestrated from Washington.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So we got 4 hands up. We have about 25 minutes on our timeline right now. We've got a lot of people who have questions and comments, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Laura, Roger, John, and Justin.
Okay, I had a comment. Hello, Steve. I actually remember visiting you decades ago. And a comment and a question. And the comment is, I think that even before his 2015 extraordinary threat comment, Obama, who was elected in 2008, was doing everything he could to make the US more oil sufficient. And it was before that, it was one of the major customers of Venezuela. And so here was this Venezuela who was not going along with the US interests, who had a lot of resources to back him up. So that's the comment. And the question is, what effect might there be about Alex Saab having been arrested and going to now in the US? Thank you.
I think I'm going to take a few questions and comments before we get back to Steve.
Gerry, the Saab issue is pretty complex. Maybe we could, rather than stack them, we could go into that one.
All right. Do you want to respond to that, Roger?
No, I want, that was my question. I have a comment that I did have, but that was my question as well.
Okay. All right. I guess it's back in your lap, Steve, if you have a perspective on the Alex Saab situation.
Well, I think that, as I said before, there are gray areas which I think that we have to recognize. There are certain issues that we just don't have enough information. I mean, unless you have inside information, unless you are on the inside, there are a lot of things that we just don't know. I'll give you one example of something. This doesn't answer your question about Alex Saab, but it shines light on the point I'm trying to make about gray areas. And that is that under Maduro, a lot of the shots were being called by Diosdado Cabello. And that had a lot to do with the situation in the military. Diosdado Cabello comes from the military. He was participated in one of the Chavez coup attempt in 1992, and he's considered the key person. And with regard to the military, if the military were to turn on Maduro, and Mike Pompeo called on the Venezuelan military explicitly, openly, publicly to overthrow Maduro. And if that had happened, if the military had turned on Maduro, it would have been all over for the Chavistas. So the whole issue of the military and the whole issue of the type of influence that Diosdado may have, perhaps policies that were more to his liking than to Maduro's liking. I mean, those kinds of nuances stem from issues that we really can't say we have a hold on with regard to the military. How can we really say what that dynamic is all about? And that's just an example of a gray area, which I think we have to recognize. With regard to Alex Saab, the same thing. A lot has been said about him. And we really don't know what was discovered about him, whether information came out that is reliable information. We don't know. I mean, the Chavista people like Diosdado Cabello has said things about Alex Saab, and it's really impossible for one who doesn't have access to inside information to really be able to say anything about that. But just in general, I would say that Delcio Rodriguez, there's a lot of things, one can criticize about Delcio Rodriguez, but I would say that the best way to frame that is that our criticisms need to be tentative for the simple reason that we don't know what I said before about the give and take between Washington and the Delcy Rodriguez government. She's putting up resistance. Washington is calling on her to do certain things, but those decisions are not decided overnight. And we have evidence to that effect. In fact, statements from people in the Trump administration who say that they talk to Delcy Rodriguez and people close to her, 5 or 6 times a day. So we know that it's not a question of imposition, it's a question of negotiations. And those details we just really we're not able to really make an opinion based on hard facts. But it could be that, we criticize that decision that she made to turn him over to the United States. I mean, that could be a criticism, but I just want to emphasize that criticisms along those lines have to be tentative.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, we got John and Fred and Jill up. Go ahead, John Perry.
Oh no, I had a comment I wanted to
Oh, you're
make.
not finished. Okay, Roger. Go ahead.
I hadn't started, I'm afraid. So, Gerry, thank you for beginning with the mention of the earthquakes. Those are very important. Responses to that have been in the social media. I've been following them very closely. There's been a lot of responses. Some of the responses are how we can support the Venezuelans. Others recognize what you perceptively, I believe, alluded to was the idea of this was an opportunity for disaster capitalism. In particular, one of the responses that came out this morning was the fact that the Israelis may be sending aid to Venezuela. And that was one of the responses to that was that this was yet another intolerable red line that Delcy has crossed. And I just wanted to not so much comment on the comment, but to mention another historical precedent that reminded me of, and particularly because there's so many Nicaragua activists here. And that is in April of 2018, remember the coup in Nicaragua. And what that was precipitated by, the first thing that happened was that there was a fire in the John, what's the name of the biopreserve in the biopreserve in Nicaragua, and immediately there was this huge media campaign that the Nicaraguan government had refused aid from Costa Rica to assist with the fire. It turned out that there was a good reason, and the reason why is that the biopreserve is a roadless area, and the aid was in the form of fire trucks that couldn't access that. But that was the incident that was used that was kind of the spark that started the whole coup effort back there. So I think we have to think about how the position of the Rodriguez government is in right now, where if it refuses aid, it also gets itself in a position that the Nicaraguan government was in 2018. My question though is, Steve, you mentioned Alex Saab. That's one of those hard pills to swallow. Another one is the extrajudicial killing of Nino Guerrero. Rather than in the joint Venezuela-U.S. military operation. Could you comment on that?
Well, yeah, I would say, we're talking about red flags, and I wouldn't use that term with regard to any of these incidences. You can criticize it, but like I said before, if you contextualize what's happening and you say, well, what are the options? What would happen if Delcy Rodriguez bucked Washington? and said, no, you can't do that, even though you know where this guy is located, but we're not going to allow you to come in and carry out that kind of operation. And Trump would come back and say, well, it's all over. We're going to activate the second plan for an incursion in which we'll finish what we began on January 3rd. I mean, you could say perhaps she has more leeway. Perhaps Trump wouldn't have done that. You can hypothesize a lot. And I'm not saying that you can't criticize her. What I'm saying is that the use of the term red flag or red line, that it's a red line, that that is not a good metaphor. I think you've got to recognize that these are thorny issues. You might disagree with her decision, but I think we have to appreciate what's at stake. And also we have to appreciate the fact that she has obviously access to a lot of information that we don't have access to. So that, not to say that we don't have a right to criticize, I firmly disagree with people in the solidarity movement who say us gringos don't have a right. Well, our job is to engage in solidarity work, and we shouldn't, that's up to the Venezuelans to decide. I don't agree with that. We can criticize, but like I said before, those criticisms have to be tentative.
All right. Thank you, Steve and Roger. Okay, John Perry.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think those of us involved with the Nicaragua solidarity work are very conscious of the fact that the support for the Sandinista government comes from a hardcore of revolutionaries, but the broader support comes from the public investment which the Nicaragua government has made in health and schools and roads and housing and so on. And presumably something similar applies in Venezuela. And really, my question is, will the government in these new circumstances be able to sustain that public investment, the 4 million homes program, the investment in food security and the other things that have been possible up till now, despite the sanctions and the very difficult economic circumstances?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question because, I mean, it relates to what I said before about the fact that the revenue that comes from the sale of oil and exports in general is held outside of the United States now in an account in the United States, and that the decisions with regard to those allocations are given the stamp of approval by no one less than Marco Rubio. So it is, an important issue. For instance, the communes are symbolically extremely important. And I don't mean symbolically in an innocuous kind of way, because it points in the direction of a transformation. I wouldn't overemphasize the importance of the communes. The communes are not solving, fundamental economic problems that Venezuela faces, the Venezuelan economy faces, but they're important in terms of pointing the direction of a transformation that is really the goal of the Chavista movement practically from the very outset. So those communes are sustained to a certain extent by government subsidies. Maduro kind of put that on the back burner for several years there. But around 2020 or 2021, I think 2022 or so, he called that the year of the communes. And he started, re-emphasizing the importance of the communes. To what extent can Delcy Rodriguez sustain that? And the housing program, which is also an important, very important program that has been very popular among Venezuelans in general, particularly the popular sectors. Whether she is able to prioritize the allocations, given the fact that Marco Rubio has a veto power. That's an important issue, and that is an issue that also the solidarity movement should raise in terms of the challenges that she faces as a result of U.S. imperialism.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Fred?
Yes, greetings. Steve, Compas. I think there's a consensus that in the solidarity movement that our principal duty is to oppose U.S. imperial intervention, not to be attacking Delcy Rodriguez. However, I'm not sure, Steve, that there's a dichotomy between it's either Delcy Rodriguez or the disaster of Machado, because a disaster is already unfolding. The strike against Nino Guerrero was not just allowing the U.S. to execute what they call their kinetic strike. There was CIA, Southern Command, and Caracas Security Force integration. And that integration is ominous. It may pose even a threat down the road to the security of the popular sectors. So I suspect that it's not a clear dichotomy that the entrance of an Israeli humanitarian mission, and I put humanitarian in quotes because these are the same organizations that work in Gaza. It may not be benevolent at all, and it's quite contrary to the trajectory of Caracas in relation to Israel. So, you know, the loss of sovereignty over hydrocarbons, the integration of security apparatus, the U.S. and Caracas, I think these already pose a very ominous situation, and we don't need a Maria Corina Machado to make this possible. What's your response, Steve?
Well, Fred, two points. One is that it seems to me, and I'll say this without any concrete proof, but I think it's obvious, anybody in the solidarity movement and anybody on the left who understands how imperialism works, I think would agree with me, that the Trump administration and the people in Washington want to humiliate Venezuela. And I mean, they're going out of their way to do that. The incident with Nino Guerrero, the U.S. Planes that landed next to the U.S. Embassy also. These incidences are really intended to be a slap in the face of not so much Delcy Rodriguez, but the Chavista movement. I mean, after all, Washington hated Chavez, and they hated the Chavista movement for everything it represented. I mean, going back to Chavez's famous speech in the United Nations, I mean, Washington was determined to teach Venezuela a lesson, and that's what they're doing. So that I think that point has to be made, that this is intentional. And the other point is that one of the reasons why we're in the solidarity movement, and one of the arguments that we put forward when we're talking to people is that, look, at the United States is forcing the Chavistas to accept actions that they don't really want to carry out. I mean, this is a blatant violation of national sovereignty. You know, it should be that if Delcy Rodriguez wanted to collaborate with the United States in the killing of this guy, which, you know, I thought, you know, was horrible. I mean, he should have been captured. He should have been killed. But if she wanted to do that, then she should be given free rein. And Venezuela, the Venezuelans, should be allowed to determine things like this. But that's not the case. That's not the case. And I think the argument that we present to people has to be just that Venezuelan national sovereignty is being violated. It's being violated intentionally. There's an intentional campaign, a well thought out campaign to humiliate Venezuela and to stamp on Venezuelan national sovereignty. And so even though you may criticize her, you know, in discussion on the left, or, you know, it depends on the venue. It depends on who you're talking to. If you're, you know, giving a speech in public, or if you're trying to, reach people who aren't that political, you're not going to talk about this. But sure, it's valid to criticize a decision like that. But I think that the point has to be raised that the United States is doing this intentionally to humiliate Venezuela, and Delcy Rodriguez most likely decided to do this reluctantly. She thought, perhaps, mistakenly, but she thought that she didn't have any alternative.
Barbara?
I missed part of the meeting. I apologize. So if this was covered, then can let it go. But in terms of the international solidarity movement and maybe trying to coalesce better than we have so far, yes, of course, in the broadest sense, we should oppose imperialism. But within that, I'm thinking that given the context of the earthquakes that just happened and the terrible need for humanitarian aid, is this a time that we could push really hard, internationally speaking, for the release of the funds that have been stolen from Venezuela by the United Kingdom and the United States and so forth? Is that something that maybe could be a strategy that we could implement right now? Just
Yeah,
what are your thoughts?
I didn't raise that. It's a good point. We did talk briefly in the beginning about the situation that presents itself as a result of the two earthquakes that took place yesterday is an opportunity for the solidarity movement to raise certain issues. But that's a very good point. Venezuela needs that money more than ever, and it's Venezuela's money, and it should be returned.
Yes. Rick?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the communes and the social movements, what you hear that they are saying, and how much debate there is, and is there widespread acceptance of Delcy's compromises?
Well, somebody who's directly involved, somebody who is a solidarity activist and lives in Venezuela, Sierra Pascual Marquina, who's written about this extensively, along with her compañero Chris Gilbert. And she's stated a lot that there's a lot of democracy in these communes. They have a lot of discussion, and a lot of the discussion is, critical of certain government policies, the whole range of opinions about what's going on. But I think that there's no question about it that the social movements that they represent is an important underpinning of the Chavista movement from the very beginning. And we can't understand the Chavista phenomenon, just like we can't understand the pink tide in general. Separating the political dimension from the social dimension, the social movements. These pink tide governments came to power. Most of the pink tide leaders were social movement activists, beginning with Evo Morales, the president of the Coca Workers Union, Lula, who was a president of the Automobile Workers Union, Maduro, who was a trade union leader himself in the 1980s and 90s. So that the social movements were fundamental to understanding the rise of the pink tide, and that's the case with Venezuela. And these communes and the social movements in general are extremely important. You have a lot of debate going on, but basically they represent an important underpinning of the Chavista movement, the Chavista government.
So the Venezuela Solidarity Network had a webinar a couple of weeks ago with Sierra from the Commune Movement. I think maybe Chris Gilbert was in that too. I didn't get a chance to see that, but I'm sure it was quite good. And Leonardo just put the link in our chat. So if you can grab that in the chat, you might want to check that out later on. So we're getting close to the end here. Jill Clark, I saw you took your hand down. Is that because somebody else addressed your question, or did you still want to have a chance to say something?
Oh, I thank Steve and everybody. I just wanted to mention that at the outset when you were talking about the region, you didn't mention anything about Nicaragua. I know Nicaragua has been very fortunate in terms of compared to Cuba and Venezuela in terms of how much it has suffered from U.S. Economic and other forms of aggression. But there are things, there are a lot of signs that they're really waiting to get at Nicaragua, including the OAS General Assembly that just happened, where they were talking about, they have all their Shield of the America countries, telling them, don't just speak against these three countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, do something about it. Just wanted to mention that. Because we're all comrades here, I couldn't let that pass without mentioning.
Well, and then Cuba's facing another kind of invasion. Well, actually, the threat of an actual military invasion. I don't know if people think that's going to happen or not, but Trump has certainly threatened to do just that. And in the meantime, they're strangling Cuba really, really hard. So I think, addressing the U.S. war against Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, really go hand in hand to a significant degree, as well as a few other countries. There's a whole U.S. intervention throughout Latin America is unfortunately achieving a number of right-wing victories and kind of a right-wing trend. It's swinging. Seems like South America is always swinging one direction or the other, back and forth. But right now, it's a very disturbing trend. Nan, what do you have to say about that or anything else?
Sorry. I may be very optimistic, but at least anytime soon, I don't see the U.S. Bombing or doing what they did to Venezuela to Cuba, simply because they're doing so poorly in Iran, and it seems like people really are, tired of it. So that could help us.
Yes, I agree with you. Although another chain of thought is that after the disaster in Iran, Trump might think he can get an easy victory to soothe his hurt pride or something. So there's a number of ways of looking at that. At any rate, we have to do everything we can to defend all three of those countries vigorously, and that's why we're all here. This is a very helpful discussion, and we could go on for a while longer. Maybe we'll want to have another discussion like this in a month or so after things have cleared out a little bit. But I do think that obviously we're going to be, those of us who are in solidarity with Venezuela, which is I think all of us, are going to somehow be engaged in this effort to help uh, um, heal the wounds and rebuild in Venezuela and to counteract the disaster imperialism that'll be going on, the further intervention of the U.S. military, the concerns about intervention of Zionism, um, and uh, and I think that the initial idea that Barbara and some others have been discussing of, targeting, making a strong demand for the return of Venezuela's assets is a really good place to start. Um, Anybody have any final comments or observations or any more information that you want to share right now about uh, the earthquake disasters? I've been seeing the official death toll is something still like 164, but then I saw the U.S. Geological Survey uh, is estimating it could be thousands or even tens of thousands. So that seemed kind of out of sync with what the reports we've been getting so far, but obviously the death toll is going to grow. Anybody have any more current information about the status of the deaths and injuries in Venezuela? I guess we'll all have to be waiting in the coming days. And
Jerry, the latest I've seen is that there were 250 buildings that collapsed,
Mm-hmm.
and there's over 40,000 people who are missing.
Whoa. That's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is because there's also there's no communication in the state of La Guaira, so it might be that many of those missing people just that don't have a way to communicate. But I would expect the death toll to go into the thousands, if not tens of thousands.
Oh my. Okay. So, okay, well, our hopes and prayers and solidarity, and this discussion today will help us think more deeply about how we can best support Venezuela in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. So thank you everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. We have recorded this presentation and discussion, and if nobody here has any objections, we'll make that available to you and to other interested folks. Okay, on behalf of the Task Force on the Americas, thanks again for being here. Especially thanks to Steve Ellner for great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Steve.
Sure. We'll be in contact.
Thanks so
Definitely.
much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Steve.
Sure.